So coming to art and craft, that is an example that I would like to use to explain the difference between techne and episteme. So we've heard these two words together, almost taken almost always together, art and craft, but there is a difference between the two. Craft is governed by techniques. There is a way of doing it. There are techniques of doing a piece of art, of craft. But art on the other hand has intuitive leaps. So you are particularly, or one must particularly be aware or heard of artists breaking molds, breaking techniques and doing something new. So art is not bound by techniques, because techniques that give us simplicity and clarity can also be techniques that bind us, that do not allow us to push the envelope. So when we want to do out of the box thinking, or we want to do something unusual, somebody who is very technique driven will find it difficult to push the envelope or go beyond technique. So art typically, art and craft together is of course always a subject in schools and colleges, but they are two distinct methods of doing things. Craft is about following a technique and art is about not being limited by the technique and letting the intuitive process take its own way. So now, summing up, let me read out what philosophy is. Well, one, philosophy deals with the most fundamental questions. It is questioning the obvious and what makes the obvious obvious. So philosophy is dealing with the most fundamental questions. So that can be philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of life. When we look at, especially let me take a lived experience example that perhaps many of us have had. In conversations when somebody has lost something or is in a state of despair and defeat, one tends to be philosophical. What does it mean there, to be philosophical? So to be philosophical about life. So to be philosophical about life is to look at what is the point of life. Is success the point of life? Is victory the point of life? What is the point of playing the game? So whenever we ask such existential questions, that are fundamental questions in human life. So being philosophical about life is asking existential questions of life. What is the point of life? What is the point of fighting, not fighting, winning, losing, cheating, not cheating, point of sticking to the rules? So when we ask these questions, we are also asking fundamental questions, and this is in the domain of the human life. The same questions or the same fundamental question can be asked in various domains. So in social sciences, in physics, in language, we all have, when philosophy of language looks into the philosophical underpinnings of language as an life form. Second, philosophy is a study of foundations of knowledge and various knowledge endeavors. Hence, philosophy is a second order study. That is, philosophy is a study of foundations of knowledge. So what is peculiar, when you want to look at is this philosophical or is this not philosophical, the first filter that should come to your mind is whether this is asking a foundational question or not. Asking a foundational question is very often a philosophical question. Then what is not a philosophical question? That might again be, well, if this seems too widespread and exhaustive, what is it, what kind of questions are not philosophical questions? And here, philosophical questions are questions that are not empirically resolvable questions, although they help and are helped by empirical inquiries, but they are not empirically resolvable questions. So if you look at and here you can see the commonality between theory and philosophy is when we look, say, going back to the example of the archaeologist who has dug up certain artifacts. Well, those are empirical content, but those empirical content do not tell the story of the way people were living their lives then. That requires a theoretical leap, that requires a story, that requires an interpretation to connect these empirical artifacts to what kind of life people were living then. Philosophy attempts at articulating assumptions, making the implicit explicit. Now, what does that mean? Well, as a philosopher, when you wear the philosopher's cap, and I am wearing a cap today, but this is not a philosopher's cap, just a cap. So, when you are a philosopher, you are articulating assumptions. You are able to look at the assumptions of a position, right? So, when somebody does something, or when there is a policy, or when there is a decision made, you should be able to analyze what is the value position, or what is the position from which this decision is being made. Say a welfare state where there is an increase in taxes. So, you need to understand that, well, where is this coming from? Perhaps the parliament has debated, and the parliament which echoes the philosophy of the nation is more inclined to being a welfare state, and therefore justifies increasing taxes. Or if a real politic explanation that comes to be. If you look at newspaper editorials, they are classical cases of philosophical pieces connected to day-to-day life. Say, sometimes they unearth the assumptions of decisions made and policies given. So, making the implicit explicit, that means everything that is understood, that we know implicitly, we articulate it and make it explicit. And in this process of making it explicit, we understand it much better. So, if those of you perhaps who are used to writing a life journal or a life diary, or your day-to-day reflecting and writing on your experiences in life, would understand the value of making this implicit explicit. We all go through life, right? But then when you think over your experiences of the day and write it down or make it explicit, there is a newer understanding to yourself that emerges. That is when you make the implicit explicit and some knowledge is created. And that is more of an introspective self knowledge for your own self. Philosophy is also the spirit as a core motto of any project. It articulates the fundamental values of the project. So, when you say a philosophy of a company, or a philosophy of an organization, or a philosophy of a nation, is what it means is that it is the abstract, it is the core or the motto of any project. Or any, say a school has a motto, the motto determines the philosophy of the school. So, philosophy articulates the fundamental values of the project, no matter what the project be. Philosophy as an ever self-correcting endeavor, and that is the property of knowledge too. Not looking for an eternal absolute answer, but rather the best possible answer under the current situation. It accepts the fallibility of knowledge. So, philosophy as a self-correcting endeavor. So, and that is true also for knowledge, that knowledge has to be falsifiable, it has to be revisable. That means we are not looking at eternal knowledge claims, but we are looking at knowledge claims that fit the bill now. Say, and if you look at the history of knowledge, knowledge claims have always been revised in various disciplines that you look at. Say, at one time the world was supposed to be geocentric, then heliocentric. Look at biology, when we looked at milk as the most nutritious food available. Now we look at the tendency is to understand milk as not a very suitable food for nutrition source for humans. So, that knowledge is revisable, is epitomized in philosophy, that we are open to revision. That's an ever correcting endeavor. And then the question, why philosophize? Now, the question to why philosophize is, let me counter question, why climb the Everest? Now, those people who are climbing the Everest or any mountain peak or any adventure, there is always an easier way to reach there, right? You can take a helicopter ride to that place, or you can watch a film, the details of that place. What is it that powers this sense of adventure in people who are undertake these tasks, for which there is a very safe, comfortable alternative path to reach? Well, curiosity and the experience. So, philosophizing, like many Greek philosophers would have it, is something which is being, which we are embedded with just by virtue of being human. Curiosity, making sense of the world and oneself as an individual, a community and species. So, curiosity, yes, that is a fundamental drive for philosophy. At the existential level, it is to make sense of the world and to make sense of one's own self, both independently and within the world. But if that isn't enough, and we should pay heed to how it affects the world out there, lest this sounds too esoteric and unconnected to the world we inhabit. To philosophize is to reach and articulate the axioms of any knowledge endeavor, and having a better understanding of the foundations, one can know better. So the whole point of articulating what is foundational, this process leads to more accurate description of knowledge and lays the foundations for a revision whenever that is required. Fallibility of knowledge, what we talked about, is a philosophical outlook that strongly resists dogmatism. Dogmatism is unquestioned belief, and what we just talked about is knowledge being fallible, being revisable. It is ever open to revision when presented with better and more compelling evidence. This is fallibility of knowledge. That is a crux of philosophical method. Conflicts often occur when dogma prevails. With fallibility of knowledge as a background, conflicts lessen and knowledge enhances. So this is, if we are looking for a practical takeaway from doing philosophy, is societies which are less philosophical, or companies or organizations or families which are less philosophical, tend to have more dissatisfaction because dogma prevails and one fights for one's dogma without being open to understand or the other's position, or to revise one's position in light of new knowledge. So conflicts often occur when dogma prevails. With the fallibility of knowledge as a background, conflicts lessen and knowledge enhances. Knowledge has a seesaw history, seesawing between paradigms, or what many of you may have heard of as paradigm shifts. It results from a perpetual conceptual examination. So there are paradigm shifts in the story of knowledge in history that we see, that where at one point one paradigm was held as extreme and there was a paradigm that we changed. So when one, and this is why history is important to make sense of the world, is when one looks at the way ideas have seesawed all through the history, once gaining enormous prominence, and at one other time being condemned, and then again coming back into vogue. So to look at this seesawing nature of knowledge is also promotes the perpetual conceptual examination that philosophy as a discipline moves to. Now, as a student of philosophy, what should you be doing, or as a budding philosopher, not just as an academic philosopher, but a philosopher in spirit? You should be able to, and this will also be hopefully the takeaway, the learning outcomes from this course, you should be able, one, to identify foundational philosophical positions in the most empirical of all questions. So to identify assumptions, that is going to be your fundamental question. Then unearth the foundational assumptions of any claim and become aware of the limitations owing to the assumptions. Connected to the previous claim, that once we arrive at the foundational assumptions, then we can be aware of the limitations owing from these assumptions. And what does this ultimately do? 3, finally, is debate better, and more importantly, gain from debate. So now before I end, I would share the wisdom of philosophy, and wisdom is a word used in philosophy. Wisdom studies is a part of philosophy. To look at debate not as a platform to only advocate for the views one holds, but also as a learning platform. Until there is debate, and I can understand there will be a lot of disappointment and impatience with debate, because debate delays processes very often, or sometimes does not get resolved and leads to a standstill. But if you look at the option of the alternative to debate, it is coercion, it is force. So that is where debate sounds better, and that is where debate is a better method of engaging with differing opinions. And to be philosophical is to be able to debate, and debate not just in arguing for what one is convinced of, but being open to revise what one has earlier held as convincing. So with this, I invite you all to into a journey of philosophy, and hope it is useful and self-revealing to you to make sense of the positions that you hold, and to understand others, and to exercise your intellect and spirit to make sense of the world of values that we inhabit. Thank you.